For less than $200, I put together this tiny cinema lens kit that includes 2 matching lenses with follow focus gears, the same mount, the same filter size, fully manual aperture and focus. And last but not least, they're ultra light and absolutely tiny. All of that for less than $200. Let's check them out. So first off, we have the Canon FD28mm f2.8. And so this is a vintage lens from Canon, which means this was produced somewhere between the 70s and 80s. Now, I'm not gonna go super in deep with this, but vintage lenses give you this certain characteristic that gives you almost a film-like feel. You know, because of how old vintage lenses are, especially this one being from the 1970s or 80s. You know, technology and production just wasn't as advanced as it is now. So lenses typically had more issues like chromatic aberration, less sharpness, a lot more flaring and things like that, which of course are technically issues, but in the cinema and film realm, that type of thing is almost what you want to lean towards to, you know, really add character to your films, versus something like a commercial where you just want it to be really sharp, really bright. That's as far as I'm gonna go into that right now, although I did make a video talking about vintage lenses and adapting them to mirrorless cameras, which I'll link down in the description if you want to learn more about vintage lenses themselves. And so the second lens is another Canon FD lens from around the same time period, but this is a 50mm f1.8. So a 28mm 2.8 and a 50mm f1.8 is pretty much the two main focal lengths you'll want in a cinema lens kit like this. You know, especially if you're on full frame, 28mm is a nice wide focal length. You know, of course it's not an ultra wide, you're not gonna have crazy amounts of distortion, but it's a wide enough focal length where you can really get most wide standard shots you need to. And then you have the 50mm f1.8. This is going to be slightly more zoomed in, not really telephoto, but being more zoomed in with an f1.8 aperture, this will be more of your close-up lens to really separate your foreground from the background. That shallow depth of field, really close-up look, you can get those with the 50mm f1.8. Now, of course, since I said these are vintage lenses, you have to buy them used. Now, I will link a few places down in the description that I would recommend looking for used lenses at, like KEH.com is really good with vintage lenses, and then eBay.com. That's where I shop for all of my vintage stuff usually, if I don't use KEH. But usually if you use eBay, you can find better deals. It's just more risky. Or you can use a website like KEH, which is gonna be a lot more trustworthy. They have a good return policy, a warranty, everything like that. But the lenses are gonna be a little more expensive. All right, so now that we covered why I chose these lenses and what they actually are, let's get into how I modded these to kind of turn them into cinema lenses. And while I'm doing that, I'm gonna kind of just show the prices of everything too. And so the 28mm lens you can find used for right around $80. Sometimes a little more, sometimes a little bit less, but I find it's usually right around that $80 price point. The 50mm lens is a little cheaper. This is right around 50 bucks. This is a really common lens. It was widely produced, so you can find it for really cheap. You know, if you looked hard enough, you could probably find this at a thrift store for like $10 somewhere. So besides the lenses themselves, I also put on some follow focus gears on these. Now these are Tilta follow focus gears. You can find these on B&H for like $2. So in total, I bought 2 of these, one for each lens. That was $4 for the follow focus gears. Now you can also get these for the aperture rings as well. Now these have to be kind of a specific size, and I'll link that size down in the description if you do want to buy these rings for these exact lenses. And lastly, to make these just a little bit simpler, I got step-up rings to make these both 77mm filter threads, since most of my ND filters and polarizers and everything like that are 77mm. And there you go. With all that, you have a cinema lens kit with 2 different focal lengths, with the same mounts, follow focus gears, the same filter thread size, and they both cover full frame. So like I said, both of these lenses have the Canon FD mount. Now luckily you can adapt these to basically any mirrorless camera. Whether you have a Fuji X mount, Sony E mount, Canon RF mount, Canon EFM mount, Micro Four Thirds mount, and no matter which mirrorless camera you have, as long as it's a mirrorless camera, you can pick up like a $10 to $20 adapter to adapt these lenses to whichever camera you have. Now, if you have a DSLR, like something with a Nikon F mount or Canon EF mount, these are gonna be a lot more difficult to adapt, and sometimes they won't even be able to be adapted. And there's ways to work around that. You can change the physical mount on this rather than buying an adapter like this. However, those are gonna be much more complicated and expensive, and really the best way to get the most use out of these lenses is honestly on a mirrorless camera. Because when it comes to adapters, you can actually get a bunch of different types of adapters, like this one right here. And this is actually a variable ND adapter. So you can see right here, I rotate this gear and it's a variable ND filter, but it's built into the adapter. So I don't even have to put a filter on the front of this lens. I can install this adapter right here and then just control the ND right there behind the aperture on the lens. And you can get a bunch of different adapters that are similar to this, but that do slightly different things. Like you can get speed booster adapters for Canon FD lenses. You can get circular polarizer adapters. You can get drop-in filter adapters. There's just so many different types of adapters you can get to maximize these lenses even more. But that's kind of the rundown on, adapters and adapting these lenses. Again, these are probably gonna suit you best if you have a mirrorless camera. So I ran some sharpness tests and comparisons with these lenses just to show you how they're going to perform in a real-life scenario. And both lenses are surprisingly sharp at f2.8 in the center of the screen. Now there's definitely quite a bit of sharpness fall off on the edges and corners, but at f2.8 around the center of the screen, which is where most of your subjects are going to be in general as it is, both of these lenses are surprisingly sharp. Now the 50mm does open up to f1.8, and at f1.8 the 50mm lens is pretty smeary and soft. But like I said, once you stop down to f2.8 with the 50mm and even wide open at f2.8 with the 28mm lens, the sharpness really blew me away for the price and the age of these lenses. And so to show you this, I compared both of these lenses with my Sigma 28-70 f2.8 contemporary lens. And so when comparing the FD 28mm and 50mm to the Sigma 28-70 at the same focal lengths, you can see these lenses are very similar in terms of sharpness in the center of the screen, and there's even some areas where the vintage lenses outperform the Sigma lens and sharpness. Now something to note is that both these vintage lenses towards the corners and edges of the screen are gonna really fall off a lot, and that's where a lot of these vintage lens issues are gonna come in. They just can't keep, the same sharpness throughout the entire image like a lot of newer lenses can do really well. And also when it comes to bokeh, it's much smoother on the Sigma lens versus these vintage lenses. Now this in particular is a lot more of a personal preference thing. I mean, I would say overall the Sigma does look better and smoother and less distracting, and it's definitely not different enough to be any sort of a deal breaker. And then if we look at flaring, you can see both of these lenses do have quite a lot of flaring, but for a vintage lens, it's definitely not overpowering. And they both have pretty similar types and colors of flaring, so they're gonna match up pretty well in that aspect. But let me know down in the comments if you think this set is worth $200, and I'll see you in the next video.